Hello, welcome to episode 300 of the New Scientist Weekly podcast.
Woohoo!
Yeah. I'm Rowan Hooper.
And I'm Penny Sachet. 300 episodes!
300, it's great. It's actually a good place for a refresh. I'm going to talk about that at the end of the show. On this week's show, we're going to hear about a landmark moment for holding fossil fuel companies to account. We're going to look at the legacy of Pope Francis and what we might expect from the next Pope, the next leader of 1.4 billion Catholics around the world.
But we're going to start with a remarkable story. Scientists have genetically engineered synapses into mice's brains. So that in itself is an amazing feat. But the scientists were also able to target the synapses that make mice more sociable or perhaps reduce their risk of OCD-like symptoms, which suggests that down the line, this could have potential for treating certain mental health conditions. And we've got Alexandra Thompson here today to talk to us about it. You edited the story on this, Alex. Can you start by telling us what motivated the researchers to attempt something like this in the first place?
Well, I'm actually going to start by giving a little bit of context because This is really complex stuff.
Yeah.
So very briefly, signals or nerve impulses are transmitted between neurons via synapses, which are the small gaps between where two neurons meet. So in mammals, these connections tend to be chemical and rely on neurotransmitters, but they can also be electrical, which rely on proteins called connexins. So to answer your question, what motivated the scientists, who were from Duke University, was this just sheer body of research that suggests that many mental health conditions seem to occur when something goes awry with the neurotransmitter chemical system, which led them to wonder if they could sort of bypass those signals by putting in electrical ones in the brain.
I hadn't actually thought about electrical connections between synapses. I always thought about the chemical neurotransmitters and there's all this electrical part of it as well. You just think of the electrical impulse down the line.
I remember when I was learning a little bit about this, I can't remember if it was at school or university, you spend so much time learning about like the neurotransmitters, the chemicals, and then there was like a mention of the electrical messaging, the direct sort of, because it is more direct, isn't it? It doesn't have to diffuse across the gaps. Yeah. It was like an afterthought, and I always wanted to know more, and now we do.
Yeah, no, I was exactly the same, because you just hear about neurotransmitters when I was at university. So maybe that's because it's so much more common in mammals. We sort of default to learning about humans and mammals a lot.
So, this is pretty fundamental neuroscience. How do you even start with a project like this?
They started by looking for proteins from other organisms that could be used as connexins in mice. So that involved trawling through a lot of scientific literature. And they opted in the end for connexins called 34.7 and 35, which are actually in white perch fish.
Well, there you go.
And these connexins would later be used by the nerve cells on either side of the junction at the synapse. Sort of think of it like the positive and negative terminals of a battery.
Okay, so they found these connexins that sort of allow this direct electrical signal. But how did they know where to insert them in the brain?
Yeah, well, that was the next step in this research. So they implanted electrodes about the width of a hair into many different areas of mice's brains to record their electrical activity. So it sort of created like a map of how different information flows through the brain. They then exposed them to situations that might make them anxious or aggressive to see how that flow changed, so they could then pinpoint the cells that should receive the engineered synapses.
Yeah, so I can see how you identify them, but that's one thing. But then how do you get these engineered bits into the brain?
So that was done by injecting a harmless virus that was carrying the genetic information needed to make the connexins. So when the scientists did this, it resulted in working electrical synapses that changed how electricity moved in the frontal cortex of their brains.
Wow. And so that, I guess, maybe overrode what the chemical synapses were doing, and then the mouse behaved according to what it was being told to do by the electrical synapses.
Exactly. They became more sociable and more explorative, which sort of suggests this could potentially help people with social anxiety. And then in another experiment, they targeted a circuit between the frontal cortex and an area of the brain called the thalamus, which can cause mice. They sort of freeze in place when they're scared or stressed. And when they introduced the synapses in that circuit, it enhanced communications between those two brain regions and it stopped them freezing.
Wow. And you mentioned, we mentioned the potential for OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. How would you go about treating that?
Well, this is yet another part of the experiment. So they introduced these connexins into juvenile mice that had been genetically predisposed to develop OCD-like symptoms.
Right.
So in mice, that's things like excessive grooming to the point that they develop lesions on their face usually. So when they were given these synapses, they groomed much less, and 2/3 of them never developed those lesions.
Wow. So I do remember, having been around the block a long time, something similar being done years ago, not in a mammal though.
No, that would have been done in a nematode worm in 2014. So, yes, scientists in Cambridge did that work. But those worms, as impressive though it was, they only have 302 neurons versus 71 million in a mice. So it's a totally different kettle of fish, really. Also, you can't really observe the effects of things like sociability or exploration or OCD-like symptoms in a worm.
And you mentioned the Cambridge group, and I went back to them and I asked them what they thought of the new work. So here's William Schaefer of the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge.
Yeah, I found it really exciting to read these papers. When we did our work in worms over 10 years ago, we always thought about whether this could possibly work in vertebrates. But in worms, we had the advantage that invertebrates use a completely different type of protein to make electrical synapses. So all you had to do to engineer a new connection was to introduce the vertebrate version. But these researchers had to specially engineer the gap junction molecules from vertebrates so they wouldn't interact with the molecules that are already in the brain. So this was really kind of a challenging thing to do, and it's really cool that they got it to work. And I guess the idea that this could be used to treat mental and neurological conditions, they tested on a OCD model, is really fascinating. And in principle, I think it could work for any condition where the neural circuit mechanism is understood. Now, that's a big if, but people are learning more all the time. I guess one thing to keep in mind, though, is that electrical synapses are a lot simpler than chemical synapses. That's why this technique was able to work. You only have to manipulate a few proteins. But what that also means is that these connections are a lot more hardwired. I mean, in fact, an electrical synapse actually more or less is making a wire between two neurons rather than making a complex chemical signal. And so what that means is that the changes you engineer in the brain using this technique could be difficult to reverse. Now, in a lot of cases, that would be worth it, because if you have a really debilitating condition that makes the patient's life really hard, it would definitely be worth it if you could find a solution like this. But I think the difficulty in reversing the changes that you introduce into the brain is a reason to be a bit cautious. But overall, I think it's a super cool set of papers, and I'm really interested to see where it goes in the future.
I think that really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Like permanent changes, but there might be a case for doing them if you've got a really debilitating condition. But it's still a long way off, obviously, right?
It is a long way off, but even so, the people we spoke to for this story were pretty optimistic. So to start with, if you think about, it's just a mouse, they're a long way from humans, but the researchers selected those connexins, the proteins that connect the synapses, partly on the basis they expected them to work in people. And we already have atlases of gene expression profiles, so we could pretty easily identify which cells to target without implanting the electrodes like they had to.
Who's going to volunteer for the first permanent brain editing? There are big ethical implications for this, aren't there?
Oh, no question. We need much more research. So we don't know the long-term consequences. Maybe the brain finds sort of workarounds, and then there's safety and long-term side effects. And also you'd need consent from an individual or their family if they weren't compos mentis. But it's just, the researchers said it's just nice to have something on the table for people who really could benefit from this, maybe who don't respond to medications. It could make a real difference for them.
I am really sceptical about this. It's such a drastic thing to do. And the thing that just stands out to me is like the brain, there's still so much that we don't really even understand about it. So irreversible changes to it seems like quite a step, to say the least. But what I did wonder was, does the work in itself help us with that problem that we don't fully understand the brain? Is this a really useful tool for starting to probe some of those things we still don't know?
I think surely it must be. They have engineered synapses in a mouse, and it has 71 million neurons. Not to downplay the worm, but this is a much bigger deal.
Yeah, these are mammals.
Yeah, these are mammals, and a lot of the brain structures are conserved in mammals, and it tells us more about the role of different brain structures and brain activity between those structures. knows. So I'm not saying this is something that will be available super soon. It's a study in animals, and there's the safety and there's the ethical implications, but I'm a bit more excited maybe.
I think what this really reminds me of is, again, a while ago, optogenetics. Do you remember? Was a huge thing 15 to 20 years ago. And so that was a technique where you essentially genetically modified neurons, brain cells in mice, and you could activate them or deactivate them using light. And there was so much excitement about that at the time.
Yeah. I remember talking to someone at MIT about this. But what happened to optogenetics?
So obviously we're not now routinely tweaking our brains with light. But it did turn out to be a really useful technique for studying all kinds of things in the brain, like how neurons are made, how memory works. So potentially this is going to be a useful tool for that too.
What about in humans? The
optogenetics?
Yeah.
There have been some trials. I was just looking into it actually earlier, particularly for things like treating eye disease, because you need light to make it work. But nothing major as far as I could see. And it's a reminder that these kind of massive experimental breakthroughs, especially in neuroscience, can take a really long time to come through.
Okay, we talked on the podcast before about, there's hundreds of lawsuits around the world that are seeking to sue fossil fuel companies and other major emitters of greenhouse gases. Sue them for climate-related damages, whether that's extreme heat waves or floods or wildfires.
Yeah, and last week we had Freddie Otto on the show talking about the science of climate attribution.
We did. And this week we've got some major new research coming out. This presents what could be a powerful new line of evidence for climate campaigners who are trying to win those lawsuits. James Deneen is here to tell us about it. James.
One of the big obstacles facing these lawsuits is the scientific challenge of linking emissions from an individual source, say ExxonMobil or Chevron, to a particular climate-related damage, such as deaths during a severe heat wave in India. There's no doubt that the emissions generated by producing and burning those companies' products have played a role in driving climate change in general. We also know that many extreme events have been exacerbated by climate change, but we haven't really seen research linking together that full causal chain in a robust way.
Right, because it must be really difficult to make that link.
Yeah, it definitely is, especially in a way that would convince a court. But now we've seen something like that. Two climate scientists, Justin Mencken and Chris Callahan, demonstrated how advances in attribution science enable them to link emissions from specific fossil fuel companies to climate-related economic damages in particular places.
Right, so you can really imagine that being useful if you're trying to make some kind of legal case.
So yeah, Mencken told me that not having this information to date has allowed some of these companies to maintain what he called a veil of plausible deniability.
So now the veil is sort of being pulled up. Briefly, how does this method work then?
So it's pretty complicated. There are a bunch of steps, but basically they use a climate model to simulate how temperatures would change in specific regions with and without the emissions of a particular company over a certain time frame. Then they estimate how the resulting temperatures in that region would have affected economic activity. And they've shown in previous work that small increases in temperature during the hottest days of the year can reliably be linked to economic declines in many parts of the world, for instance, from damage to crops, lost productivity, or deaths. So now they have this full causal chain from emissions to a change in heat to damages, in this case, economic losses.
Wow. And when you link that chain together, you end up with some quite big numbers, don't you?
Yeah, really big ones. So considering the emissions generated by extracting and burning the fuels produced by 111 of the world's largest fossil fuel companies, they found the increase in extreme temperature caused by these emissions led to lost income of somewhere between $12 trillion and $49 trillion between 1991 and 2020. That's taking all the largest fossil fuel companies together. But just looking at the top 5 largest emitters, which is Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and BP, each of those companies were linked to more than $1 trillion in losses during that period.
Wow.
So that's big picture, but they can also now sort of attribute and unpick specific extreme weather events.
Yeah, they showed this in the paper. They looked at a specific heat waves in particular countries. For instance, they find that Chevron's global emissions caused between $4 billion and $61 billion in lost income just in the continental U.S. by raising temperatures during the 2012 heat wave here.
We should mention at this point that none of the companies mentioned have responded to a request for comment here. James, you mentioned that the study looked at heat, but, as we said earlier, there are other ways, of course, that climate change can cause damages. Have they tried to look at those yet?
Yeah, so as you said, they only looked at heat. But
Right.
In principle, the researchers told me this framework could work for any kind of climate-related hazard, whether that's wildfire, flooding, or deaths from heat. But it would require using different models and would likely be even more complex. But this study doesn't claim or really aim to capture everything. It's just trying to show that it's now possible to make a clear link from emissions from an individual company to climate-related damages resulting from those emissions.
That feels like quite a step then when it comes to climate law cases. So the companies didn't respond to our request for comment. But what have they said more generally, publicly, in response to the lawsuits that many of them are fighting?
Yeah, there are loads of different arguments that they've made. But one big one is that they should not be held responsible for the emissions from burning the fuels they produced. These numbers would be far smaller if we only considered the emissions from extracting the fuels.
Well, this is a big one, they say all the time. It's about Scope 3 emissions, they call it in the jargon. They want to argue, big oil companies want to argue that they're not responsible for what consumers do with their product, which I think is a bit like the gun arguments, the argument that guns don't kill people, people do. And so there should be no restriction on gun sales or ownership.
It's an interesting question, but as Chris Callahan, one of the researchers, told me, it's really one that's beyond the scope of attribution research.
This is an argument they've made as well, right? That if the emissions come from the car, why are you not holding the driver accountable? Or why are we held accountable for the downstream decisions made by consumers? And I think this is totally fair, frankly, or at least it's not really a question that science can answer, right? Where you locate the responsibility is a legal and political and ethical question, not necessarily a scientific one. However, I think it is fair to say that if we think about two different actors in a market transaction, I don't know you personally all that well. I suspect you personally did not engage in a decades-long campaign of disinformation and delay to prevent climate action. I do know that ExxonMobil did. And so it makes sense to me that responsibility is not equally shared between those two market actors. Given the emerging evidence of the additional false disclosures by these companies, at least in the public realm, the ways that these companies try to delay climate action and prevent people from having access to alternative energy sources, I think it's fair to place responsibility on the fossil fuel producer instead of the fossil fuel consumer.
There are also plenty of other legal and political reasons that these lawsuits could fail, even if this type of attribution science is sound. For instance, courts could decide that climate liability is a question that's for legislatures to decide rather than a jury or a judge. In the U.S., for instance, the Trump administration has pursued ways to protect companies from these types of climate liability lawsuits, as well as some emerging state-level laws that are trying to fine companies for their historical emissions.
But whatever way you slice it, this is not good news for big oil companies. Not going to welcome this paper, are they?
Yeah, I think that's probably fair to expect, and it will be interesting to see, how and if this paper gets cited in, the many ongoing lawsuits. In any case, future juries are likely to see more of these cases. Here's something that struck me from one of the researchers, Justin Mencken.
This is science that I think resolves this question of can we do this, and the answer is unequivocally yes. And I think that we're about one team of teams working on this, and this science is going to evolve rapidly, I believe, and become better and better. And so I think increasingly juries and people's experience of the climate system is informing them that there are meaningful changes afoot, and it is totally intuitive to them that these changes could be traced back to particular sets of emissions.
Okay, I want to talk about the Pope. Pope Francis died on Monday, and we're in the run-up to the election of a new Pope. And did anyone see Conclave?
I haven't seen it, no.
I haven't. This is the Ray Fiennes film, isn't it?
Yeah, about the secretive election of a new Pope. Isabella Rossellini was brilliant in this, by the way.
As she is in everything.
She is. So look, Pope Francis died on Monday morning. He was quite shocking as a pope in a few ways that interest us on this podcast.
One of the things looking back was for a pope, he was pretty progressive on sexual health. There was some stuff about condoms, right?
Yeah, he said it wasn't evil for women to use condoms if there was the threat of Zika virus. He was still fundamentally opposed to abortion, even for women carrying fetuses that were infected with Zika. So, he wasn't completely liberal.
Wasn't all in.
No.
And there were similar things with HIV and condom use too, I think.
Yeah, he said the same thing, that if one of the partners had HIV, it was okay to use condoms in that case.
But the big thing, I guess, is climate change?
Yeah, he was really influential in all he did on climate change.
Yeah, and he sort of tied it in with critiques of capitalism and consumerism. He sort of went there.
He had some really good lines. Look, he said humanity was turning the glorious creation of God into a polluted wasteland full of debris, desolation and filth. He blamed the climate crisis on people's selfish and boundless thirst for power, although what we've just heard in the previous story might say we might want to blame the fossil fuel companies on some of that as well.
Yes, lawsuits are pending.
Yeah. But look, what I was wondering, though, was how much difference did that stance really make? That's the first thing, given that emissions have been going up since he became Pope. And second, what's going to happen next?
I guess, is there a way we can find out what kind of a difference he made?
I think so. I mean, arguably, he did make a difference. He was the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics, the spiritual leader. During his time, he made it a matter of faith not to destroy the planet, which hadn't really been done before. And so that was a real important sort of change of doctrine. And he also campaigned really a lot for indigenous people.
Yeah, and that's had a big impact in Latin America in particular.
Yeah, so he did an exhortation, which is basically a letter, an official letter, called Querida Amazonia, which means beloved Amazonia, in February 2020. And that really amplified the voices of indigenous people in the Amazon region. And it was really important, I think, for the Pope to have this stance, because I found this survey in the journal NPJ Climate Action showing that Catholics are less likely to believe that humans cause climate change than other Christians.
Interesting.
Yeah. So this was quite, more than 13,000 people responded to this survey across 18 Latin American countries. It also found a negative relationship between trust in the church and belief in anthropogenic climate change.
And trust was one of these things too that he was working to restore.
He was trying, yeah. It may be that Catholics are generally more conservative than other Christians. And maybe one of the problems you can say with Pope Francis's message was that it didn't change the minds of people who had already made their minds up about climate change.
Yeah, preaching to the converted or the not converted, as it were.
Well, yeah, he was. The survey authors suggest that public demand for climate action might increase if the Catholic Church instructed their diocese regionally, rather than just leave it to the Pope, instruct them to talk and make a direct, coherent, affirmative position on action for climate change.
That's quite interesting then, isn't it? It's not just about who's at the top, it's about getting the message
it needs to ripple down.
Yeah, really interesting. Is that something then that we can sort of hope for from the next Pope?
So that's the big question. So the positive climate stance of Pope Francis, we obviously want that to continue. I had a chat with a historian of the Catholic Church at the University of Oxford, Miles Pattenden, about this, and here he is.
The new Pope will, in theory, have the authority to change church teaching as he thinks best. However, popes are usually very cautious about going where the Catholic faithful may not follow. On questions of bioethics, I would expect little change from the new Vatican regime. The Catholic Church's opposition to abortion, eugenics and euthanasia will remain absolute. On contraception, the Church has been moving for some time towards qualified acceptance that some contexts make it a lesser evil, when one partner is HIV positive, for instance. More recently, in 2016, Pope Francis acknowledged that it might also not be evil if contraception was used to prevent transmission of the Zika virus.
That's an interesting point about popes being cautious about going where their flock will follow. And if they go too extreme, then you just get ignored and people leave the church. And here's Miles Pattenden again.
The area where there could be greatest room for change is in the Church's approach to environmental issues. Francis was an advocate of global significance for decarbonisation. His 2015 encyclical letter, Laudato Si, and its follow-up, Laudate Deum, in 2023, both talked about the importance of care for what he called our common home. A new pope might be more sceptical. The global debate has moved on from 2015 to focus on trade-offs and mitigation strategies. Francis's strong emphasis on absolute reductions in carbon emissions suited the Church's politics during his pontificate. This was almost the only policy issue for which he was able to unite European progressives and conservatives from the global south. A new pope might face a different calculation, or he may decide that he has to shift his approach to keep his teaching relevant. We will just have to see.
It's interesting that there was this political calculation between uniting the European progressives and the global south, and that often hadn't been able to be done, but he managed that through climate stuff. I mean, what I take away from it is that it's really important to keep talking about climate change. People outside of the bubble of this podcast, to get them on board. The other thing I take away is, I have to say I didn't really pay any attention to Pope Francis for most of the time. But what he did, the Pope before him had didn't say anything about climate change. So now I actually appreciate what Pope Francis did.
I remember that in that first encyclical being a big deal.
Yeah.
And I do think in the time that he was Pope, there has been this shift. Climate change is very much a part of our culture. People do talk about it a lot more now. So it's hard to attribute it. But I imagine it played a role, right?
Yes.
That's all for this week. As Rowan said, we're changing things up for next week. We're refreshing the show after 300 episodes.
Yeah, we're regenerating to a new model. It's got a new name, The World, the Universe and Us.
You don't have to resubscribe. You'll see us pop up in your feeds from next week, though, with the new title, The World, the Universe and Us. Same great content, but a new name.
In fact, why don't you subscribe now so that you can say that you were a subscriber, part of the original
right from the
listenership.
beginning.
Yeah.
Thanks to our guests and thanks to you for listening to all 300 of the episodes, I'm sure.
We'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Bye.